The ridge stretched endlessly, a tangle of pine and birch rolling toward the horizon where the sun burned like a low fire. Mist curled among the trees, wet and slow, clinging to the engineer's boots as he trudged along the narrow trail. Each step pressed against mud thick as clay, the weight of his traps and supplies a constant reminder of the wilderness's demands. Behind him, his dog padded quietly, ears twitching at every whisper of wind or snap of branch. The world beyond the trees was a rumor, the forest, a judge, jury, and teacher all at once. He paused at a hollowed stump, adjusting a snare with hands that bore the maps of decades in the woods, blisters, scars, and lines like riverbeds. The animal caught in this trap would feed them for days, perhaps weeks, but more than that, it was a test of his patience, his cunning. He studied the tension of the wire, the angle of the branch, the way light fell across the clearing, imagining the snare as a miniature battlefield. Even here in quiet isolation, he sought perfection. The forest demanded it. His mind, restless and calculating, drifted to the cabin he had been building for months. The genius cabin, as he had begun to call it aloud in moments of quiet triumph, was more than shelter. It was a companion of sorts, a creature molded from wood, stone, and mechanics. He had poured sweat, blood, and a little madness into it. Hidden vents that drew warmth from a hearth even while he slept miles away, walls insulated with clever layering, water channels that could move silently yet serve practical needs. It was a house that could think, in some small, obedient way. Setting his pack down, he pulled out a tattered notebook, its pages smudged with ash and pencil. He traced a diagram of the flue system with a fingertip, imagining the way smoke would curl and heat would rise, the way cold air would sink without fail. In this quiet, he could almost hear the cabin breathing, a subtle sigh as if it approved, or perhaps merely awaited the next test. A gust rattled the trees, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine sap, and he shivered, not from cold, but anticipation. The forest could be merciless. He had learned that lesson over and over, through frostbitten toes and flooded floors, through near collapse of rafters and sparks that leapt too close to dry wood. Each failure had been a tutor, each success a whispered promise. He rose and moved deliberately, boots crunching against the needle-strewn floor of the woods, recalling the careful placement of each log in the cabin's walls, each notch cut for precision airflow. Every element had a purpose. Nothing was frivolous. As he walked, his eyes caught a distant shadow among the trees, a bear perhaps curious but cautious. He held his breath, waiting, and the animal moved on without incident. Even the wilderness seemed to respect careful calculation. By dusk, he reached the cabin. It sat on a small rise, its roof dark against the burning horizon, the smoke from the hearth curling lazily skyward. There was satisfaction in this sight. Logs stacked tight, windows shuttered but alive with flickering firelight, the subtle hum of hidden mechanisms at work. He circled the cabin, checking each vent, each sluice of water, each hidden bell he had devised a signal if anyone or anything approached. A minor flaw would not be forgiven in the long months ahead, and he would not forgive himself for it either. He moved inside, the dog padding behind him, and knelt beside the hearth. Lighting a small fire, he watched the flames dance and lick the corners of the room. The heat began to rise just as he intended, circulating through vents he had crafted from years of trial and error. The cabin responded to him the way a horse might to a skilled rider or a lock to a careful hand, obedient, loyal, unerring. A small smile touched his face. He was leaving soon, for days, perhaps weeks, and yet the cabin would survive, perhaps even thrive, packing supplies for the journey ahead. He felt the familiar ache in his shoulders, the persistent thrum of a mind always at work. He knew he could not stay forever, that the traps in the forest demanded movement, attention, cunning. Yet leaving meant trusting the cabin to act in his stead, to hold fast against frost, wind, and the subtle, creeping mischief of the world beyond the ridge. He paused at the doorway, placing a hand against the cool, polished wood. In that moment, he felt a quiet kinship with the structure he had created, a reflection of his mind, patient, relentless, and clever. As the sun sank fully behind the ridges, painting the forest in molten gold and shadow, he turned toward the trail. Behind him, the cabin breathed, a sentinel in waiting, the faint whistle of its vents like a heartbeat. He disappeared into the twilight, leaving warmth, fire, and ingenuity in his wake, and the forest exhaled around the clever dwelling. For the first time, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, tempered with anticipation. The world would test the cabin, and the cabin would answer. Night had fallen like a black curtain over the ridge, and the cabin stood quietly, breathing steam and smoke into the frosty air. Rain drummed against the roof, a relentless percussion, while wind tugged at the eaves, whistling through every hidden crevice. The engineer crouched behind a ridge, far enough to observe but close enough to catch the subtlest movement. He was a shadow himself, eyes sharp, senses taut. Even absent from his walls, his creation lived, anticipating, reacting, surviving. From the darkness, another shadow emerged. A trapper, or perhaps an outlaw, slipped through the wet underbrush, boots squelching in mud, rifle slung carelessly across his back. He expected emptiness. He expected the cabin to be helpless. What he did not expect was the faint hiss of valves, the soft clink of hidden bells, or the whisper of a flue closing with precision. The engineer's mind raced through contingencies, calculating each possible intrusion, each angle of approach. The forest, usually indifferent, now conspired with him. Inside the cabin, mechanisms responded as if guided by instinct. Vents shifted, redirecting warm air and masking the scent of fire. Water sluices whispered, redirecting runoff, masking movement. A hidden bell clanged faintly, warning of the interloper's presence, but not enough to betray the cabin entirely. Shadows danced across walls, flames flickering against polished wood, creating the illusion of movement, of vigilance. The engineer felt a thrill. The house was alive in his absence, a mirror of his mind, calculating, clever, patient. The rival moved closer, stepping onto the threshold with the confidence of one who believed nothing could resist him. A gust of wind slammed the shutters shut, startling him. He cursed, his voice swallowed by the storm. The engineer watched, pull steady, as the cabin's design revealed its genius. False doors, hidden pathways, and the subtle placement of noisemakers led the intruder on a dance through corridors that seemed to stretch and twist beyond reason. Each misstep was a lesson in humility. Each hesitation, a surrender to the cleverness of a mind he could not match. A bear appeared at the far corner of the clearing, drawn by the scent of fire. The intruder froze. The cabin's mechanism shifted again. A vent redirected smoke. A sluice shifted water to create a sudden splash, startling the bear back into the woods. Nature, manipulated without cruelty, acted as an extension of the engineer's will. The rival trembled, realizing the world itself was aligned against him. He fired a shot into the night, a hollow challenge, and the cabin replied with silence, its walls absorbing and dispersing sound, masking every heartbeat within. The storm peaked, lightning streaking across the sky, illuminating the engineer crouched on the ridge, eyes reflecting firelight and rain. The cabin held firm, untouched, responded to every threat without hesitation. The rival, exhausted, confused, and increasingly fearful, retreated into the woods, slipping on mud and roots, swallowed by shadows. The engineer allowed himself a rare grin. He had tested the cabin against both human cunning and the raw elements, and it had passed with unerring precision. Dawn came quietly, pale and tentative, filtering through the wet trees. The storm had spent itself, leaving the forest glistening with rain and frost. The engineer approached the cabin slowly, boots careful on slick stones, the dog padding softly at his side. Steam rose gently from the chimney, curling into the crisp morning air. The doors and shutters remained intact. The clever mechanisms had done their work. He ran a hand over the polished wood, feeling the warmth that had circulated silently throughout the night. In that moment, he understood what he had truly built. Not a mere shelter, not a simple refuge from frost or storm, but companion, a sentinel, a reflection of his own mind. It had thought, it had acted, and it had survived where many would have failed. The forest seemed to exhale, a quiet acknowledgement of ingenuity and determination, a subtle bow to the engineer who had dared to imagine more than survival. He stepped inside, allowing the heat to wash over him, watching the flames flicker as if in quiet applause. There was satisfaction here, deep and unspoken, but it was tempered with anticipation. The world would continue to test the cabin, as it always tested those who dare to challenge it. But for now, at this ridge in the Tennessee backcountry, warmth prevailed, ingenuity triumphed, and a man and his creation stood together, unbroken, vigilant, and alive. The engineer's eyes lingered on the subtle movements of flues, vents, and sluices, all in perfect harmony. He could leave again tomorrow, and the cabin would endure. It had proven itself, not merely as a shelter, but as a mind, a fortress, a living testament to careful thought, patience, and courage. And somewhere deep in the forest, life whispered, observing, waiting, perhaps even admiring, as the engineer allowed himself a final, quiet smile before disappearing along the trail once more. The morning fog hung thick over the ridge, curling through the pines like ghostly serpents. The engineer returned to the cabin with the dog padding silently at his side, the earth still slick from last night's storm. Each footprint pressed into the damp soil felt like a punctuation in the forest's ongoing dialogue, a conversation he had long learned to listen to. The air smelled of pine resin and wet stone, and for a moment he paused to inhale, letting the wilderness fill him. But the calm was deceptive. He could sense it, an almost imperceptible shift in the rhythm of the woods, the faint crack of branches out of place, the weight of unseen eyes. Inside the cabin, the fire had died to glowing embers, and the mechanisms he had designed hummed faintly, as if stretching after a night of vigilance. He knelt beside the hearth, fingers brushing warm stones, noting subtle changes in the vents and sluices. The systems had survived the storm and the human intruder, but the engineer knew the forest was patient, and patience was a form of threat. He had built this cabin to endure, but the world outside would not forgive complacency. A rustle drew his attention to the clearing beyond the cabin. He did not move immediately. He observed. From the mist emerged a figure, smaller and less confident than the rival from before, yet no less dangerous in its uncertainty. A boy, perhaps, or a young trapper testing his courage. The engineer's eyes narrowed, calculating. This newcomer was not here to destroy the cabin outright, but curiosity and greed could be just as deadly. He watched the youth fumble, rifle clutched awkwardly, stepping on roots and slipping through mud. Every movement was a question, every misstep a clue. The cabin responded without command. Vent flaps shifted subtly, redirecting warm air, masking scent trails. A sluice shifted water to mimic human movement, splashing into a hollow, creating a false path. Small bells, hidden within walls, jingled faintly, nudging the intruder away from the most vulnerable points. The engineer allowed a rare smile. His creation moved with cunning he alone had designed. It thought, adapted, survived. The youth froze, realizing the cabin was no ordinary dwelling. A chair tilted slightly from its previous position. A hidden floorboard shifted, and the subtle patterns of heat and shadow betrayed no ordinary house, but a sentinel alive with purpose. The engineer's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from anticipation. He stepped quietly closer, careful to remain unseen, savoring the dance between his invention and the interloper. Suddenly, a gust of wind slammed the shutter shut, startling the youth. He fired a shot, echoing into the mist, a hollow declaration. The engineer felt the hairs rise on his neck as the cabin responded. Vents hissed, redirecting smoke. Sluices shunted water along the floorboards, startling the intruder and masking sound. Hidden traps clicked into place, not lethal, but effective in enforcing boundaries. The boys stumbled, slipping into a shallow ditch, and the engineer exhaled slowly, appreciating the elegant balance of consequence without cruelty. Night fell again, faster this time, shadows stretching long and unnatural across the forest floor. The engineer moved from ridge to ridge, observing, calculating, anticipating. The youth, exhausted and bewildered, realized he could not outwit the cabin. Every approach met a subtle counter. Every plan dissolved before it could take form. The engineer's pride swelled quietly. His work had not merely survived storms and human threats, but had outwitted them with grace. As midnight approached, a break in the clouds revealed a slender crescent moon. The engineer descended toward the cabin, careful and deliberate. Steam curled from the chimney, the faint hum of hidden mechanisms a lullaby to the silent forest. The youth had retreated into the trees, finally understanding the lesson the cabin and its creator offered. Cleverness, patience, and respect for the wild were not to be trifled with. He would return to the world, carrying stories of a place that defied expectation, perhaps even awe. The engineer entered the cabin, closing the door behind him with the satisfaction of a man who had tested his mind against the world and found it capable. He knelt beside the fire, fingers tracing the warmth still circulating through vents, and allowed himself a rare sense of completion. The cabin had endured. The forest had conspired, subtly, but the triumph belonged to him. He leaned back against the wall, eyes wandering to the patterns of light and shadow dancing across the room. The cabin was more than wood and stone. It was a living testament, an extension of his will, and a silent sentinel for seasons yet to come. Outside, the forest whispered, alive with unseen movement, and he understood the truth he had always suspected. Survival was not merely about endurance, but about intelligence, adaptation, and a quiet audacity to create something that could think in your absence. The fire crackled, the vents sighed, and the cabin seemed to exhale in tandem with him. The engineer allowed himself a final, slow smile, knowing that the frontier could rage, storms could batter, and human curiosity could intrude, but his creation would endure. And somewhere deep in the Tennessee backcountry, in the quiet after wind and rain, the cabin waited, alive, clever, and vigilant, ready to meet whatever the world dared to send next. The first chill of autumn seeped into the forest, crawling along the ridges and pooling in hollows. The engineer returned to his cabin with a careful, measured pace, the dog trailing silently, ears alert. He had spent weeks away, checking traps and tending to the few settlements along the ridge, but the thought of home, of the cabin breathing and waiting for him, drew him onward with quiet urgency. Every snapped twig underfoot, every whisper wind, was catalogued and stored in his mind, as if the forest itself were testing his alertness. The cabin appeared in a clearing, smoke curling from the chimney like a sentinel's signal. It had survived the storms and the previous intrusions, but nature had its own agenda. Leaves clung to the roof. Rainwater pooled in hollows he had failed to anticipate, and a low moan of wind rattled the shutters. Yet even in disarray, the cabin exuded intelligence, a quiet authority that no storm could breach. He ran a hand along the polished wood, feeling the warmth that still lingered within the walls, proof of the subtle currents of heat and life he had engineered. He paused at the edge of the clearing, noticing fresh tracks. Not animal, not quite, though the forest was thick with bears and wolves. Human, faint but deliberate. A chill traveled up his spine, not from cold, but from awareness. Whoever had passed his way moved with care, observing, noting, perhaps testing. The engineer's pulse quickened, and he crouched behind a tree, eyes sweeping every shadow, every shift in light. The cabin would defend itself, but his curiosity demanded vigilance. The figure emerged, cautious, hesitant. A trapper, perhaps, young but determined, rifle slung across the back, eyes wide with curiosity and fear. He had heard stories, no doubt, whispered along ridges and valleys of the cabin that thought, that breathed, that outwitted intruders. And now he was here, testing the legend against reality. The engineer studied him, noting every motion, the tilt of his shoulders, the unsteady step. He understood the boy's intentions before a word was spoken. Not malice, but ambition, a hunger for knowledge, a desire to conquer what had never been conquered. The cabin responded almost instinctively. Vents shifted to redirect warmth and mask scent. Hidden sluices released small streams of water, splashing in calculated patterns, misleading the intruder. Tiny bells crafted a signal intrusion without revealing their source, clanged softly inside walls. Shadows flickered as firelight danced, creating illusions of movement, of vigilance. The engineer allowed himself a faint, satisfied smile. The creation he had poured years into move of precision, anticipation, and cunning, exactly as he had intended. The trapper hesitated at the threshold, rifle raised, eyes flicking to subtle movements that betrayed nothing but suggested much. A floorboard creaked under an unseen weight. A vent hissed. A subtle change in light caught the corner of his eye. He stepped back, uncertainty rooting him to the spot. The engineer's pulse beat steady, observing, calculating. The boy had underestimated the forest, underestimated the house, underestimated the mind that had built both. As dusk settled, the wind rose, rattling trees and stirring mist across the clearing. The trapper fired. A single shot that shattered silence but caused no harm. The cabin reacted instantly. Vents redirected smoke to obscure him. Sluices sent a sudden rush of water along the floor, startling him. The engineer watched from a ridge, pride tempered by caution. He had created not merely a home, but a sentinel, capable of survival against both the forest's fury and human curiosity. Exhausted, the intruder finally retreated, slipping into the shadows, slipping on slick roots, swallowed by the darkness. The engineer allowed himself a slow, steady breath, savoring the triumph but remaining alert. The forest exhaled around the cabin, acknowledging both its ingenuity and persistence of the human mind. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the ridges with molten amber and violet, and the cabin stood silently, its vents sighing, its hearth glowing faintly, alive in its quiet dominion. He descended toward the clearing, each step measured, each breath deliberate. The cabin welcomed him with warmth, a subtle hum of mechanisms, the quiet assertion of life that had endured every challenge. He knelt beside the fire, fingers brushing heated stones, and allowed himself a rare, complete satisfaction. The creation had survived storms, intruders, and nature's caprice. It was perfect in its purpose, a companion as loyal as it was clever. Leaning against the wall, eyes tracing the patterns of firelight and shadow, he understood the full scope of what he had wrought. This was not merely shelter. It was an extension of his mind, a testament to ingenuity, patience, and unwavering persistence. Outside, the forest whispered, alive with unseen eyes and shifting leaves. But the cabin held, steadfast and vigilant. The engineer smiled faintly, letting the quiet fill him, knowing that the frontier could rage, storms could batter, and human curiosity could intrude, but his creation would endure. And as darkness settled over the ridge, he felt the subtle, profound satisfaction of mind and a home perfectly attuned to each other, ready to meet whatever the wild demanded next.